Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Pranay and today I have with me my colleague Lokendra, and today we are going to be talking about what's happening in the world of social media versus the state. And this was a rather interesting past days for the contest between state and social media companies. There were some things that happened in France, then in Brazil, and we thought it would be a good episode to take stock of these developments and understand why is this confrontation taking place and what might be some of the lessons that we need to be aware of. So Lokendra, welcome to this episode.
Thank you so much, Pranay, for welcoming me. And yes, it was an interesting month of August 2024, in which two major developments unfolded in the global social media landscape that has caused a churn in this industry worldwide. So first, let's go to France. There, Pavel Durov, who is the CEO of popular Telegram platform, he was arrested and he was charged with complicity in crimes that took place on the Telegram platform and also for not cooperating with the French investigative agencies. Now, after days of detention and questioning, he was released on a 5 million euro bail. And since his release, Pavel has assured of working on bettering content moderation policies at Telegram. So this was one event that took place in Europe. And in a different continent, in South America, there was a tiff and tussle that was going on between Elon Musk's X, which was formerly Twitter, and Brazil's Supreme Court. And this all started in April earlier this year when the Supreme Court had asked X to take down certain accounts which are associated with spreading misinformation on Bolsonaro's 2022 defeat. Now, at that time, X had opposed these takedown requests, and in protest, Musk had withdrawn the legal representative of X in Brazil. And now, coming back to August 2024, the Supreme Court imposed a fine and banned access to X in the country because X failed to appoint a legal representative and comply with Brazil's law. And even those using VPNs to access X were warned by Supreme Court, and they are going to be subject of a fine about 9,000 US dollars, which is quite high. So Supreme Court has come down heavily on X for acting like a extra legal entity, so to speak. Musk has, in his characteristic way, remained defiant and also targeted the Supreme Court and Lula's government. So these are two developments that happened. What made me think through these developments in a deeper way is that I was aware in past when autocratic states have banned social media platforms or regulated them in a restrictive way.
Yeah,
They
and
have
China
even
is a case in point where a lot of things have changed on social media, and
Yeah.
generally the government is getting stricter towards
Yeah.
companies which have an information system presence.
Yeah, China is a wonderful example, as Pranay rightly said. Then you have North Korea, Iran, and a host of other countries which are generally on the autocratic side of governance. But you never expected liberal democracies to take that route. Liberal democracies have had a struggle with social media platforms in the past, but they have shied away from outrightly, taking such drastic steps like arresting a tech executive or banning the platform. Even India, which has had an issue with WhatsApp and also X, has not so far banned or arrested an executive like that. So there's a deeper shift we can see in the way liberal democracies are now approaching social media platforms. And this is what I wanted to discuss with you as well. What do you think about these deeper shifts? Do you think it is too early for us to make such an assessment? Or do you think liberal democracies are learning a thing or two from autocratic states? Pranay?
Yeah, so the way I was thinking about it is one earlier social media companies when they began, say, let's say with Facebook, uh, 2007 or 2008. And through that 10 years, there was this huge enthusiasm about social media being providing one place where the entire world can discuss everything in large groups, right? So there was a lot of euphoria, promise of that idea. And that has sort of subsided over the last few years. So from being seen as things that are largely a part of the solution, the governments are also trying to be more concerned about what is the impact of social media on the cognitive side of things to their own citizens. So, for example, because social media companies are also involved in have their own algorithms, so they are already doing some form of screening about what is shown and what is not shown. So, in that way, they do become arbiters of the cognitive infrastructure, right? They are playing a role. People from all across the world can see some things are highlighted, some things aren't. So that's why governments across the world, whether they are autocratic or democratic, are at least taking cognizance of the role of social media companies more and more. And I think it's a gradual process. We've seen that the angst against social media companies growing in one way or the other. And now, I guess some countries have already put in these rules. The fact that you had a rule that you need to have a legal representative in Brazil shows that they are trying to form some form of accounting mechanism which can help address the concerns of countries and yet allow social media companies to operate the way they want. So it's sort of a work in progress, regulations which are trying to be propped up in order to counter some misuse. Now, there is an international relations angle as well, right? For example, what the US is doing with respect to TikTok. Now, there the angle is that there is an adversary, there's a company which has some ties with an adversary nation state, and given that they are playing an important role in the cognitive space of Americans, there is a concern that can that algorithmic control be used to influence the cognitive infrastructure of America, right? So that's why there is one angle about what is the role that a social media company which is owned by companies or players who have some connections with the adversary state, what should your interaction with this kind of social media company be? Now, in India, took a step long ago where it banned TikTok already around when the Galwan incident happened. So that was India's stance. I think US is also trying to find other ways to approach this, whether TikTok should be bought by an American firm or not. Right. So those are the kinds of things which are taking place from the international relations angle. Here, what we are seeing is it's not necessarily the ownership was not of some adversary nation state, but the fact that there was concern that the sovereign nation state has some authority over how these systems operate within their borders. And there was some concern that these two social media companies were not adhering to the rules set by these nation states. And that's why there is a reaction against them. Right. So, how do you think about it?
So, what I think is that there's a growing frustration in liberal democracies, especially when it concerns law enforcement. Uh, they are increasingly frustrated with the lack of response from social media platforms when it comes to content moderation. They think that these platforms are not doing enough. And when law enforcement agencies approach these platforms hide behind the cloak of, protecting privacy and encryption. So there's this tussle that is going on. And for years, it festered. And the liberal democratic states, they kept their patience. But now, with increasingly, millions of people joining social media across the world, and with connectivity increasing, the misuse of this platform is also growing. And I think we have reached an inflection point. We reached a point where increasingly other states, not just Brazil and France, but other states within European Union or South America or in Asia will increasingly go the autocratic way of arresting and banning, because they are not able to find other ways to coerce. Because even if you see Pavel's example, before Pavel was arrested, he was not doing much on moderation front. Telegram was very, very evasive on such requests. But since his arrest, and he has come out, he has released public statements and he has assured that he's going to work on content moderation. So the global chatter is right now, what changed in just few days of arrest? Like, is it necessary to arrest a tech executive to force a policy change? Are such drastic measures required? Similarly, with Musk, the banning of platform happened because X was acting as if they don't have to comply with Brazilian law, right? So, can any social media platform proclaim it is above any jurisdiction law? So, I mean, these issues definitely indicate that liberal democracies are shifting gears now. And this frustration has reached its peak. That is what it appears to me. And we are going to see more of such drastic measures in coming time.
So, thinking of it from the Indian perspective, given that what has happened in France has already happened, so from that perspective, does it send a deterrent signal? And does it mean that many social media companies will be more proactive on content moderation now?
Yeah, I think so. There will be more proactiveness. Yes, this does send a chilling signal to all tech executive that somehow they are beyond like national laws. In India's case, particularly, India has had tough policies when it comes to social media intermediaries, as India calls them, for some time now. So, for instance, of what was formerly Twitter and now X, India has been issuing a lot of content takedown requests associated with farmers' protests or with the elections. And X has had issues with them. They have taken Indian government to court on them, and so on and so forth. Even WhatsApp recently, earlier this year, threatened to exit India if WhatsApp was forced to break encryption and identify the originator of messages. So India has had a history of this tiff with social media platforms. What India did in 2021 was release these rules for social media intermediaries under the IT Act of 2000. And these rules have been amended subsequently over the last couple of years. So, as it stands currently, these social media platforms are supposed to have a resident compliance officer, grievance officer, and a nodal officer. And this nodal officer to do back and forth with law enforcement agencies here. And failure to comply with these rules is severe for social media platforms. And once any objectionable account or post is brought to social media platforms notice by the government, they have to take it down. So, and the redressal mechanisms for social media platforms, if they do not agree with the government, those are not strengthened, those are not good. So, we are India, there are reports that say India issues some of the highest content takedown requests, for instance. So, but this also is an important issue because we need to find the right balance between the legitimate quest for maintaining law and order and also respecting freedom of speech and privacy. So far in India, we have failed or struggled to strike that right balance. And that is what I also wanted to discuss more with you. How can India strike that right balance? What do we need to do for that?
Yeah, I think that this balance is a tough one to strike, especially like you were mentioning. It might be very easy for governments to, once you give the governments the power to determine what should be posted and what shouldn't be posted, there can be content moderation and content takedown requests for the opposition parties, right? Some things that the government might not like, they might say that this should not be said. And that's very scary for a country which prides itself on a democratic tradition, right? So, where is the balance is an interesting question. I think the idea that you need to have some representative in your nation state which can address some of these queries is probably a good one. You should have someone such that this request can be, at least if there is some violation of a particular law of the land, then you need to know who is the person you take this problem to. So that I would say is a fair request. But what counts as being something that social media companies should take down and what doesn't count, that I think shouldn't be in the hands of the government alone. Probably there needs to be a committee which is in charge of this, or an institution which comes out with certain principles, certain ideas that can then counter, right? That would be one way. The other way would be, I think the better, more enlightened way would be for our law and order agencies to become a part of the network. And that we have seen over the last few years, that Indian police, for example, maintains a very active presence on social media companies. Some of the common ones, like you will see most of the police officers being on Twitter, etc. So I think once you develop a credible presence on that, see what are we fearful of, right? There might be some cases where there is some sort of misinformation, and that misinformation before the state can act leads to riots or leads to panic, which people are not able to address. Now, one way to say it is send this deterrence effect, but that will also mean that many other things, people will not criticize the government when legitimately it is required that we criticize the government. So the other way would be if there's a credible presence of our law and order agencies, and if some of these things happen, they quickly go in and stop that preference cascade. And this has happened many times when the police has had good presence. It has been able to stop a preference cascade quickly. When these kinds of things happen, you won't actually need the deterrence effect, right? You're solving this problem by having a presence on social media. So I think that would be a better way out, where we think of, can government be a part of this network, or government itself uh, transform itself into some of these characteristics that a network has, which is quicker flow of information, being networked, not necessarily waiting for hierarchical flow of information that only the DGP will take an
Sure.
action. So if a police inspector is able to quickly address in their area that, we are on track, we are looking at this issue, no need to panic, these kinds of messages, if they are quickly sent, then the things that we are fearful of most, like a riot or a quick escalation of things, can be stopped easily. So I think that is what I would urge, or I would expect the government to spend more time and energy on, rather than blanket bans of this sort. What do you think?
Thanks, Pranay. So I think the idea of law enforcement increasingly using social media platforms and in lifetime countering misinformation and stemming that, I think that's a brilliant idea and should be definitely pushed for. You also spoke about forming some, that the government should not decide what should be allowed and what should be not. There should be some committee, some sort of arrangement. Are you in favor of self-regulation by social media platforms themselves with some external representation and accountability?
Yeah. See, yeah, I mean, social media companies will do some form of self regulation, I'm sure. But see, the option is this, the alternative is this, which the government is currently doing, whether even if you have some presence above a threshold, you will need to have a legal representative, and those sorts of burdens will be there on you, right? And as France and Brazil case show, this will become a legitimate thing that every nation state will expect. So
Sure.
I mean, if you have presence in 50 countries, you will need to have 50 officers
Sure.
and the whole paraphernalia associated with it. So given that as a situation, I think it would be good if we are able to find an alternative mechanism which scales, and you don't need to have a presence everywhere, right? So if there is information sharing between different countries on what is thought of as something which shouldn't be encouraged, and that information sharing leads to takedown of some of the content which might be supremely objectionable, that might be a way out.
But such a arrangement may be difficult to come about because what is objectionable is a very contested
Fair.
thing, right? And for even for such a common understanding to emerge in India would be difficult given the polarized environment we inhabit. And when we talk about different countries having common understanding, that seems very difficult to pull off at this moment. Even it took us decades to come up with the cybercrime convention draft, which has still not been voted by United Nations. So when it concerns matters of information, cyber and content, I think the most difficult thing is how do you make people with very wildly different views of what constitutes something fair or something objectionable, how do they agree on it? For instance, when we go
Okay,
back to Brazil,
let's take a step back. What are the kinds of things do you think the government could classify as being objectionable?
so one of the things that there is consensus on, and no one objects to government's classification, is child sexual abuse material, right?
Yeah.
I so far I have not read any objection to that.
Correct. Okay.
Then there are calls to violence.
Hmm.
When someone is raising a call to violence, so that content can be taken down. But when we start approaching other subjects, which are political in nature,
Yeah.
for instance, during the farmers' protest, right? That is where the ground gets murkier.
Yeah.
Uh, because
Is misinformation, say, let's say I just say something which has, so let's say you're a politician,
Okay.
okay, and I allege that Lokendra has done a, uh, he's involved in a corruption scandal worth 30,000 crores.
Okay.
And I don't think you were involved, but let's say I make this up. And this is clear misinformation.
Okay.
Should this be counted under quote unquote objectionable? And should the government send a social media company a message that no, this should be taken down because it's false? What do you think about that?
So, when we look at it objectively, when we know for sure that this particular piece of information is incorrect, is false, and is being spread for malicious motives, and if the government sends such a request to social media platform that see this post has come to our attention and it is spreading something very very malicious and false, social media platforms are bound by Indian law to take that post down, to my understanding. But the thing is, sometimes it is not so easy to know whether an allegation that is being made is mischievous or there's some merit to it, or is it misleading, because even if the person is not involved in a scam, it is to the courts to decide. It is for the law enforcement to take its due process and decide. So if such an allegation is made, and just because of that the person making the allegation is being targeted by the government or social media or law enforcement, I think that gets a bit trickier.
Yeah, I agree. I think, see, from my perspective, I don't think misinformation and disinformation should fall under this category of being objectionable, in the sense that, I mean, I should have the freedom to say the things that I want to, even if I am not 100% sure. And that's where I think self regulation, etc., comes into being. So, for example, X having the community notes feature is a good option where people themselves are highlighting things that they think are incorrect. So I don't see a government active role, like as in, just because I am spreading some misinformation, it shouldn't be that the government holds X responsible for spreading that misinformation, right? There should be people who are countering what I've said. There might be things who think and they present their alternative point of view, because, like you said, it will be very difficult to draw the line. And soon, things which are anti government, also the government can say these are anti state and they are seditious, and then you will go down that route. So, there I see more of a role for, say, self regulation. The fact that I think the positive way of looking at this is we have moved on from that idea where we thought we need one large social media space where the entire world is, and we are going to talk on that. And we thought that would be a great thing for humanity that
Yeah.
will solve. But I think everyone realizes that that's not a great idea. Actually, you don't. People come from very different contexts. That doesn't necessarily solve a lot of problems. So even if you see how the market is maturing, that you are seeing multiple social media platforms coming up right now. X is not what it was 10 years ago. There are alternatives. There's Blue Sky. There is, people tried things with Mastodon, and there are a bunch of other things coming up. And you have seen a lot of information now go from X to, say, LinkedIn to Facebook. There are, so already you're seeing that not all the things are happening on one social media.
Pranay, on this point, there's something else at play as well. So when you rightly spoke about this whole network effect thing, right? So in 2000s and 2010, there was this whole noise about the wonders that network effect has. But now what we are seeing is increasingly over the last, I'd say, last 10 years, the political polarization is spilling into networks. So you have the left and the right, you know, pushing for or batting for different networks, so to speak. So, for instance, in Brazil's case, which we just discussed, when X was banned, another platform came up, a competitor, and all the people who align themselves in the left side or the liberal side with Lula's regime, they migrated to the new platform. But those on the right side, those aligning with Bolsonaro and everyone, they have used VPNs and other things to still use and tweet through X. So they are clearly marking their preferences. Similarly happened with in US when Trump, pushed for his own platform, Truth Social, and X was aligning towards the left side. And in India, you had briefly a X-like platform, something like Coup, come up for some time. And so you also see that because there is a whittling away of the middle ground and there's so much polarization, the networks are also getting aligned with certain ideologies and political preferences. So, do you think the network effect will be strong enough to address this, or would we increasingly see networks aligned with ideologies going forward?
No, I think both things will happen. One, you will have people trying to form new media along polarized lines. But I don't think that's going to work, because actually, the great thing about social media is that you come into, I mean, people say echo chambers, but actually, the great thing about social media is exactly the opposite. It's not so much echo chambers, it's the fact that you, because you're on a social media which has many kinds of people, you interact more frequently with people who have opposing views than otherwise. And you actually thrive on the fact that you have opposing views. So if you have social media which is formed by a political party, you will actually get bored of that, because those people will just talk about the same things. There's no opposing view, right? It thrives on the fact that you have opposing views and people exchange, and you need an other to make your point and to signal to your own group or your own cohort, so to say, right? So in that sense, I think there will be an experimentation that you will have social media along polarized lines. I would see them as extensions of political parties. It's just like a new association, just like you had a Republican party organization or a club. It's a club, a Republican Party club on the digital space. So it's that way it can form. But what's the call? What's the reason why people would be on that, right? They will just agree on everything that is to be said. So people will probably join that, have some fun, but they would want to have to talk to people who don't think like them. So in that sense, I think network effects still play an important role. We will still have broad based social media places which where people from different views come in and engage with their views. So I think there is a lot of scope for that. What I do see is there might be some specialized social media networks come in, right? So for example, it might be that we are already seeing this. So for example, a lot of better science related discussions now happen on Mastodon, right? Like many of the communities and many of the scientists who were thinking about these issues have sort of gravitated towards Mastodon for this purposes instead of Twitter. But Twitter still remains a place where at least the most broad based conversations are happening. So I think there might be these subject wise network effects happening. People will still disagree, but along there'll be interest based attraction to certain social media groups rather than because of having the same political ideology being on a particular social media.
That's a very fine take, Pranay, I would say, because and the history supports your argument, because both Coup and Trump's Truth Social, they failed to take off. They were there for some time, they generated some noise, but ultimately, as you rightly pointed out, you need the opposing side on the same platform for there to be some interest in, sustaining and continuing yourself in that platform. I think that might be one reason why X has dominated the social media landscape so much, because you find so much shrill debates on that platform and so many polarized voices at the same platform. So, but at this point, I think it is important for us to answer some fundamental questions about social media and platform liability. So, just taking two steps back. First is, do you think social media platforms are above the law in any jurisdiction, or should they be completely subservient?
No, I think law of the land should apply. There's no question about that. So
And second, the question that flows from it is, should social media platforms be held liable for their content? And when should this liability kick in?
Yeah, and I think this is a question which has always been the bone of contention, right? Even in the US, whether
Yeah.
are social media firms actually just intermediaries
Yes.
or they are playing the role of curators as well. I think right now we are speaking in 2024. At this point, we do know that they are not just playing the role of an intermediary who has nothing to do with what other people see on their social media network, right? Because clearly we know there are algorithms which where they have a role to play in what gets shown to a person, right? So that way they are not just they are playing the role of curation, and that curation means that they can't absolve themselves of all of their responsibilities. So that is one thing where we should think that they are curators. They are not just reflecting whatever is happening in
Yeah.
the world. They are
Yeah.
actively
Yeah.
doing some curation. So in that, I think some people have already proposed ways that there should be option for people to pick their own algorithm, right? So
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
example, now for example, Twitter does have a following feed, right, which is just a reverse chronological feed of the people you follow. Now that's a good measure, I would say. Now you have the option to choose what you see, right? That earlier it wasn't there, right? So that itself shows that there has been some progress on it. uh, the other way could be that the companies should throw these APIs open where other companies can build different form of algorithmic selections, and then people can choose to access Twitter through a particular API which filters in a particular way, and as that also should be an option, right? So in that sense, I think competition is the law that I mean, more competition is what I would aim as a policy objective, right? If there, because what you don't want to be in a situation is, because these social media plays a very important role in the information ecosystem and the cognitive infrastructure of citizens, you don't want one person or one company to have so much influence over your the cognitive infrastructure that you are then not able to counter them. So as long as there's competition, there are multiple players, there are multiple ways in which citizens can access. It can be one social media, but there are multiple ways in which they are able to access the feed. I think that way it sort of makes sense.
So, Pranam, what you're arguing for is that the idea of curation, which these walled gardens, right? So social media walled gardens do, they should be thrown open, right? Through interoperability and through giving more access and decision making power to public to decide what they want to see in their feeds and how those feed choices are selected. So I think I broadly agree and align with you on opening these wall gardens, so to speak. My view on these fundamental questions would be that social media platforms should not be above the law in any jurisdiction. If we say or claim otherwise, we would be handing out too much power to extraterritorial entities, which may be anti-democratic in nature, in essence. These entities are already very powerful in terms of the cognitive power they hold over us, because we don't know much about the algorithms they use, how they sort of a feed, how do we see certain content, are we being quote unquote nudged to see information in a particular way, and so on and so forth. So they hold a lot of cognitive power over us as individuals and as societies. And if we start believing that these are somehow extraterritorial and law of the land doesn't apply to them, I think it would be too much power for these entities. Then at the same time, I also recognize that there's a risk of governments over jealously abusing their legislative and regulatory powers for restricting free speech. And if we want to strike the right balance between free speech and liability concerns, we need two things in my view. First, uh, social media platforms should publish takedown orders issued by government. So there's complete transparency. It should not be done in secret, right? This is one. And second, we should make it easier for social media platforms to challenge the takedown request to an independent appellate authority with an expectation that they can obtain a verdict in a time bound manner. See, in India currently, you can still approach courts as the X and Twitter have done in the past, but the legal system is so punishing in the terms of cost and time it takes that social media platforms may not be incentivized enough to challenge each and every objectionable takedown request that they disagree with. So we need to make it easier for them to challenge this.
I would go one step further. In fact, the government should publish every takedown request they
Yeah.
make in the public domain, right? And with reasoning as to why they think this should be taken down, right? Because it's not just the responsibility of the social media company, but if our government doesn't want us to listen to someone else, then I should have the right to know why you're saying that, right? And in most conditions, I mean, you highlighted some cases like there cases of child sexual abuse, etc. Those would make sense for the government to go out and say that this is the reason why we are requesting the ban. But if there are cases where the government is actually trying to stop a voice because it is anti-government in some nature, that then I need to have a right to know that this is the reason that the government is opposing it, and I should be able to then go to the appellate authority and say that this should be allowed under law as well.
Yes, I am completely aligned with you. We need more transparency from both sides.
Hmm.
So governments need to be transparent about the orders they're issuing. Social media platforms should periodically issue reports on how they have responded to such takedown requests and give their reasons for their response as well. And the appellate authority should function well. I think if we go down this way, we should be able to strike some balance, if not the right balance. And it would be a good start in this scenario. I'll circle back at this point, Pranay, to the two developments we started our discussion with, which was arrest of Pavel in France and banning of X in Brazil. Now, two very specific questions to you. When Pavel was arrested, that too by an EU member state, what was your initial response? What do you thought about this development? Did you think it was unprecedented or something like will send shockwaves? Because you don't expect this from a EU member state, right? So what was the initial response?
Yeah, no, even my system one response was I was shocked too that why is it leading to arrest. And I think Pavel Durov then put that out on Twitter as well, that there was a sudden increase in the number of
Yes.
people who had come on the platform. We are trying to do what we can, but it's very unusual to arrest
Yes.
the person in charge, and that would sort of send a chilling effect.
Yes.
People will not want to
Yes.
get into this space. So from that sense, I think it did surprise me as well. But it shows again that there was some friction which was not being addressed, and over time it led to this kind of situation, right? So yeah, I was surprised. What about you?
No, I was not fully surprised.
Hmm.
And my understanding of this whole scenario has gone a shift when I saw how Pavel responded after the arrest.
Mhm.
So, if you look at Pavel's and Telegram's response before the arrest, they are defiant. They are not doing much on content moderation. They are blamed by host of people across the world, activists and everything, that they are simply not doing enough on harmful content, even on sexual abuse material. They are not doing enough. And after the arrest, Pavel is issuing statements saying we'll do this, we'll do this. He's already announced 2 or 3 policy changes. So one thing that did strike me was an arrest necessary to wake these guys up, right? And if so, what message does it send to other tech entrepreneurs, other tech moguls? Do you want to be arrested to bring about necessary policy changes? That is the question that came to my mind. And I think this one will alert other tech moguls as well. They'll be more cautious in taking the defiant route going forward because of what France has done. And France, again, is a liberal democracy, as liberal a democracy can be. It's an EU member state. So if France can do it, what about other states which are not that liberal or not that democratic, so to speak? And now coming to Brazil, Pranay. So when Supreme Court banned X, around millions of people lost access to X overnight, and a lot of people's livelihood depends on X. A lot of journalists use X to spread their news stories. There are so many use cases for X in Brazil. Brazil is one of the biggest markets for X right now. And when it was banned overnight, which people were not anticipating, it did cause a lot of disruption. When you look at this ban, from a livelihood and economic perspective. Do you support it, or do you think Supreme Court could have done it other way? They could have forced compliance out of X by stopping short of a ban.
Yeah, but I think they did try that, right?
Yeah.
So earlier, their demand was that you need to have a legal
Yeah.
representative, which X sort of didn't agree to. So, see, I mean, you can apply that to the Indian case as well, right? People were having significant presence on TikTok. Indian information, you can think of it the other way also. The fact that you are no longer on TikTok means that on a social media platform where the entire world is clued into, there are no Indian voices now,
Yeah.
right? So your side of the story might not go elsewhere, right? Just take an example. There is, let's say, an India Pakistan.
Sure.
Some narrative is taking place where voices from Pakistan and India are being put up. Now, on TikTok, there won't be any Indian
Yeah.
perspective. There will be a Chinese perspective. There will be a Pakistani perspective. There won't be an Indian. So that is one loss to the nation state also.
Yeah.
Besides the fact that there is a loss to individuals also,
Yes.
who were already earning livelihood, and they had this as an important way out. So both these measures, in a way, they are detrimental to the nation state
Sure.
in one way, and detrimental to individuals there. So
Sure.
I think it demands a lot more accountability for the government to ban it, right? In that sense, the government should put in place some form of ways to counter the concerns that they have. So if they had concern over what the US is considering, for example, if you have concern over TikTok's regulatory mechanism, I mean, do a case against them or get them to disclose how their algorithms are managed. Or even if you have a mechanism where they are able to position a legal representative in India, I am okay till that extent. But to ban a particular social media firm just because of these reasons doesn't make sense to me. That is a very extreme step which can only be taken after due exhaustion of all the other options that you have.
So, in this particular case in Brazil, Musk has publicly aligned himself with Bolsonaro. And the Supreme Court has been going after X for the last almost 1.5 years now. And a lot of content takedown requests were issued over the last 1.5 years, especially after the January 8 riots that broke out in Brazil after the elections and Lula was taking over. So there was a right wing opposition to Lula's presidency. Post that, we have seen these content and account takedown requests. So these
Yeah, I think, but that's what I don't have enough background to understand what were these content moderation requests for,
Okay.
right? Like, again, like we had a discussion earlier, were they because of misinformation?
Yeah.
Were they because of some call to violence?
Yeah.
These are very different things, right?
Yes.
If it was misinformation, let's say someone is trying to bat for Bolsonaro, that shouldn't count as a ground for a content takedown request, right? But if it is related to, let's say, a call for violence, and then X is not responding, that's a different kind of category of threat.
So in April, the flashpoint between X and the Supreme Court was about content takedown request on objectionable post on Bolsonaro's loss in 2022. So they were regarding misinformation, to my best understanding. And as you said, whether you go it the hard way on misinformation, or whether you find a separate or different way to tackle misinformation, that I think is a very, very tricky terrain. But yeah, it will be interesting to watch how X and Brazil deal with this going forward, because X is also facing a huge economic loss. There's a loss to the nation state, as you rightly said. And how do they resolve it? I think that is going to be an interesting case study for other liberal democracies. How do you deal with a defined social media platform within the scope of law? I think it would be interesting for us in India to also watch those developments going forward. And I'll also like to, as we are about to end our podcast today, I'll also like to leave the listeners with this broad question. Was the Supreme Court right in banning a platform? And is Elon Musk right in being defiant and blaming Lula's government? Is there a way forward from this tussle? Can we find a middle ground? This is something that I urge our listeners to think about, and also about platform accountability. how do we strike the right balance between making platforms accountable and also ensuring that free speech concerns and privacy concerns are met? I think these are larger open questions on which we'll have clarity in the years to come.
Right. And I would just add, how can we make governments more accountable as
Yes,
well?
definitely.
That should also be a part of this question. So, yeah, with that, we'll end this episode. Listeners, please do respond if you have ideas on this burning question, which I think will keep burning for the next decade or so. But happy to hear your thoughts as well. With that, we'll end this episode. Thanks, Lokendra.
Thank you, Pranay.
If you liked our show, dive into Taksashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.